Detective Sarah Martinez stepped into the precinct locker room, her small frame moving with quiet confidence through the rows of metal lockers. The morning shift was just beginning, and the familiar sounds of officers preparing for duty filled the air. Coffee brewing, equipment clicking, and the low murmur of conversations about the previous night's calls. At 28 years old, Sarah had been with the Metropolitan Police Department for 6 years. She had worked her way up from patrol officer to detective through sheer determination and an impressive solve rate that even her harshest critics couldn't ignore. But despite her proven track record, she still felt the weight of being one of only 12 female detectives in a department of over 300 officers. She opened her locker and pulled out her service belt, methodically checking each piece of equipment. Her radio, handcuffs, pepper spray, and then her most controversial choice, a compact taser instead of the standard-issue Glock pistol that every other detective carried. "Still playing with toys, Martinez?" The voice belonged to Detective Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran with a beer gut and an attitude to match. He stood behind her, his own service weapon prominently displayed on his hip like a badge of honor. Sarah didn't turn around. She continued her equipment check, her jaw tightening slightly. "It's not a toy, Morrison. It's effective non-lethal force." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that drew the attention of other officers in the locker room. "Non-lethal? What happens when some drug-crazed maniac comes at you with a knife? You gonna ask him nicely to stop while you fumble around with your little zapper?" Detective Tom Bradley, Morrison's partner, chimed in from across the room. "Come on, Frank. Leave her alone. Some people just aren't cut out for real police work." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah finally turned around, her dark eyes flashing with controlled anger. "My solve rate is higher than both of yours combined. Maybe you should worry less about my equipment choices and more about catching actual criminals." The locker room fell silent. Several officers stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. Sarah had always been quiet, professional, and focused on her work. It was rare to see her fire back at the constant stream of comments about her choice to carry a taser instead of a gun. Morrison's face reddened. "Solve rate doesn't mean anything when you're bleeding out in an alley because you brought a toy to a gunfight, sweetheart." "Don't call me sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. She closed her locker with a controlled snap and faced Morrison directly. "And for your information, I've completed the same tactical training as everyone else in this room. I've qualified expert with firearms. I choose to carry a taser because I believe in using the minimum force necessary to resolve situations." Sergeant Mike Collins, a respected supervisor, entered the locker room and immediately sensed the tension. "What's going on here?" Morrison shrugged. "Just having a friendly discussion about equipment choices, Sarge. Some of us think that when lives are on the line, you should carry tools that can actually protect you and your fellow officers." Collins looked between Morrison and Sarah, his expression neutral, but his eyes showing understanding. He had been Sarah's first partner when she made detective, and he knew her capabilities better than anyone. "Detective Martinez has been carrying approved department equipment since day one. Her choices are her own, as long as they meet department standards." "Standards," Bradley muttered under his breath. "What happens when those standards get someone killed?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past 3 years since she had made the decision to carry a taser as her primary weapon. The department allowed it. Officers could choose from an approved list of weapons as long as they qualified with them annually. But just because it was allowed didn't mean it was accepted. The truth was, Sarah's choice came from a deeply personal place. Her younger brother Miguel had been shot and killed by police during a mental health crisis when she was in college. He had been holding a kitchen knife, suffering from a psychotic episode brought on by his schizophrenia. The officers who responded had no non-lethal options available, and in the span of 30 seconds, Her brilliant brother, who had been studying engineering, was gone forever. Sarah joined the police force not for revenge, but to be the kind of officer she wished had responded that night. She wanted to be someone who looked for alternatives, who saw de-escalation as strength rather than weakness, who understood that sometimes the person holding a weapon was more afraid than threatening. But she had never shared Miguel's story with her colleagues. In a profession where showing emotion was often seen as weakness, she kept her motivations private. This led to wild speculation about why she made her equipment choices. Some thought she was too scared to carry a gun. Others believed she was some kind of bleeding-heart liberal who didn't understand the realities of police work. A few even whispered that she had failed her firearms qualification, though her expert ratings were posted on the department bulletin board for anyone to see. Collins cleared his throat. "All right, everyone. Shift briefing in 5 minutes. Martinez, you're with me today. We've got 3 active cases that need attention." As the group dispersed, Morrison couldn't resist one final jab. "Try not to get Collins killed with your toy gun, Martinez." Sarah bit back her response and followed Collins toward the briefing room. Her choice had made her an outsider in her own department, but she refused to compromise her beliefs just to fit in. The morning briefing was routine, a rundown of overnight incidents, ongoing investigations, and areas of concern throughout the city. Captain Rebecca Hayes, the precinct commander, went through the usual announcements before addressing specific assignments. "Martinez and Collins, I need you to follow up on the warehouse district burglaries. We've had 3 similar cases in the past 2 weeks, and I want to know if they're connected. The business owners are getting nervous. And I need results." Sarah nodded, pulling out her notebook to jot down details. The warehouse district was a challenging area, a mix of legitimate businesses, questionable operations, and abandoned buildings that attracted drug activity and homeless encampments. It was also where many of her male colleagues loved to point out the realities of police work. After the briefing, Collins approached her desk. "Ready to go solve some crimes?" Sarah appreciated Collins more than he probably knew. He had never questioned her equipment choices or made her feel like she had to prove herself every single day. He judged her by her work, not her gender or her personal choices. "Always ready," she replied, gathering her files. "What do we know about the pattern?" Collins spread out a map on her desk, marking the 3 burglary locations with red pins. All 3 hit during late evening hours between 9 p.m. and midnight. They're targeting businesses that deal in cash, a check cashing place, a small grocery store, and a pawn shop. The interesting thing is what they're not taking. "What do you mean?" "They're leaving behind expensive merchandise and going straight for the cash registers and safes. In 2 cases, they ignored display cases full of jewelry and electronics worth thousands. This suggests they know exactly what they want and how to get it quickly." Sarah studied the map, noting the proximity of the 3 locations to each other. "Inside knowledge?" "That's what I'm thinking. Someone familiar with these businesses. Maybe a former employee or someone who's been casing them systematically." As they prepared to leave for their first interview, Morrison walked past Sarah's desk. "Have fun in the warehouse district, Martinez. Make sure your toy is fully charged." Sarah didn't respond, but Collins gave Morrison a hard look. "You know, Frank, for someone who talks so much about being a real cop, your arrest record is pretty thin this year." The comment hit its mark. Morrison's face flushed, but he continued walking without responding. Collins turned to Sarah as they headed for their unmarked car. "Don't let him get to you. Morrison's been bitter ever since his last partner requested a transfer. Some people just can't handle working with anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of what a cop should be." "I don't let it get to me," Sarah said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The constant questioning of her choices wore on her, even if she didn't show it. "Good, because today we're going to show everyone why you're one of the best detectives in this department." As they drove toward the warehouse district, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this case would be different somehow. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and something about the pattern of these burglaries felt more complex than a simple crime of opportunity. The first stop was the check-cashing business where the most recent burglary had occurred. The owner, Mr. Chen, was a nervous man in his 50s who had run the business for over a decade without any major incidents. They knew exactly where everything was, he told Sarah and Collins, wringing his hands as he spoke. Straight to the cash drawer, then to the safe in the back room. Most people don't even know there's a safe back there. Sarah made notes while Collins examined the points of entry. Did you notice anything unusual about their behavior? How they moved, how they spoke to each other? That's just it. They didn't speak much at all. One of them seemed to be giving hand signals to the other. Very organized, very professional. This detail caught Sarah's attention. Professional burglars were unusual in this part of the city, where most crimes were committed by desperate addicts looking for quick cash to fund their next fix. As they left the check-cashing business, Collins voiced what they were both thinking. This doesn't feel like random street crime. No, it doesn't, Sarah agreed. These guys have a plan. They have inside information, and they're executing it with military precision. Neither of them realized how accurate that assessment would prove to be, or how Sarah's controversial choice of weapon would soon be put to the ultimate test. The second business visit revealed even more troubling details. Mrs. Rodriguez, who owned the small grocery store that had been hit 5 days earlier, provided information that made Sarah's suspicions crystallize into a clear theory. One of them called the other by name, she said in heavily accented English. He said, Rico, check the office when they were looking for the safe. But the strange thing was, Rico went straight to the right door. My office is behind the storage room. Customers never see it. How did he know where to go? Sarah and Collins exchanged glances. Mrs. Rodriguez, do you remember anyone asking questions about your store recently? Maybe someone who seemed too interested in your business operations? The older woman thought carefully. There was a man who came in a few weeks ago, said he was from some security company asking about alarm systems, but I already have an alarm system and I never called any security company. Can you describe him? Tall, maybe 40 years old, brown hair. He had a tattoo on his neck right here. She touched the side of her neck below her ear. It looked like military insignia. Collins made a note. Did he give you his name or a business card? He said his name was Davis, but he didn't leave a card. Said he would come back with information, but I never saw him again. Then a week later, my store was robbed. As they left the grocery store, Collins shook his head. This is getting more sophisticated by the hour. Someone's conducting surveillance, gathering intelligence, and then executing precision strikes. Military training, Sarah said. The hand signals Mrs. Rodriguez saw, the tactical approach, the reconnaissance. We're dealing with professionals. Their third stop was the pawn shop, where the owner, Eddie Torino, was more reluctant to talk. Pawn shops often dealt with questionable merchandise, and their owners were naturally suspicious of police attention. I already told the other officers everything I know, Eddie said, barely looking up from the jewelry he was examining with a jeweler's loupe. Collins leaned against the counter. Sometimes people remember details later. We're trying to catch the guys who hit you before they hit someone else. Eddie set down his loupe and finally looked at them. Look, I run a clean business here. I check IDs, I report suspicious transactions, I follow all the rules. But in this neighborhood, you learn not to ask too many questions. Sarah stepped forward. Mr. Torino, we're not here to examine your business practices. We just want to catch the people who robbed you. Did you notice anything unusual in the weeks before the robbery? Something in her tone must have convinced him. Eddie's posture relaxed slightly. There was this guy who came in a couple times asking about selling some military gear. Dog tags, patches, that kind of stuff. I told him I don't deal in military memorabilia. Too many questions from families looking for their relatives' stuff. You know? Can you describe him? White guy, probably late 30s, buzz cut, looked like he might have been military himself. Had a tattoo on his neck, some kind of unit insignia. The thing that stuck with me was his eyes, cold, like he was sizing up everything in the store. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. When was this? Maybe 3 weeks ago. He came in twice, always asking questions about my security setup when I closed, that kind of thing. I figured he was planning to sell me something expensive and wanted to make sure his merchandise would be safe. Collins asked. Did he give you a name? Said his name was Davis. The same name from the grocery store. Sarah and Collins thanked Eddie and headed back to their car, both lost in thought. We need to run this through the system, Sarah said. Military background, tattoo on the neck, using the name Davis. This guy's not being as careful as he thinks. Back at the precinct, Sarah pulled up the department's database and started running searches while Collins contacted the military liaison office. Within an hour, they had a potential match. Look at this, Sarah said, pointing to her computer screen. Marcus Davis, former Army Ranger, discharged 3 years ago under other than honorable conditions. Last known address puts him right in the warehouse district. Collins hung up his phone. I just talked to his former commanding officer. Davis was kicked out for running a black market operation selling military equipment. Apparently, he was recruiting other discharged veterans to help him. So we're dealing with a crew of former military using their training to conduct sophisticated burglaries. Sarah printed out Davis's file. Question is, how do we find them before they hit their next target? First, we need to warn the other cash businesses in the area, Collins said. Then we set up surveillance on Davis's last known address. As they prepared to leave for the warehouse district, Morrison and Bradley walked past their desks. Heading back to the mean streets, Martinez? Morrison asked. Better make sure your taser's ready for action. Bradley laughed. Maybe we should send backup. You know, someone with real firepower. Sarah had reached her limit. She stood up, her chair rolling back against her desk. You know what, Morrison? Your constant comments about my equipment are getting old. When's the last time you actually solved a case instead of just running your mouth? Morrison's face darkened. When's the last time you had to use your weapon in a real situation? Oh, wait, that's right. You haven't. Because you work nice, safe cases where the biggest threat is a shoplifter with an attitude. Collins stepped between them. That's enough. We've got work to do. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Morrison continued, ignoring Collins. She's never been tested in a real situation. When push comes to shove and lives are on the line, that toy she carries isn't going to cut it. Captain Hayes emerged from her office, drawn by the raised voices. What's the problem here? Morrison straightened up. No problem, Captain. Just expressing concern about officer safety. Hayes looked at the tense faces around her. Detective Morrison, I believe you have your own cases to work on. Detective Martinez, I want to report on the warehouse district burglaries by end of shift. As Morrison and Bradley walked away, Morrison called back, Try not to get yourself or Collins killed, Martinez. Collins waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. Sarah, I need you to know. I've worked with a lot of partners over the years, and you're one of the best. Don't let idiots like Morrison get in your head. It's not in my head, Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was, Morrison's words did bother her, not because she doubted her abilities, but because she had never been in a life-or-death situation where her choice of weapon was the deciding factor. The drive to the warehouse district took them through increasingly rough neighborhoods, abandoned buildings mixed with working factories, and the streets were dotted with people who seemed to have nowhere else to go. Davis's last known address was a converted warehouse that had been divided into cheap apartments. The building manager, a tired-looking woman in her 60s, confirmed that Davis had lived there but moved out about 6 months ago, without leaving a forwarding address. "He kept strange hours," she said, "and had visitors at all times of the night. I was happy to see him go." "Do you remember any of his visitors?" Sarah asked. "A few other military-looking guys. They all had that same hard look, you know? Like they were still soldiers even though they weren't wearing uniforms anymore." Collins showed her photos from the database of other veterans with similar discharge records. The manager identified 2 of them as frequent visitors to Davis's apartment. "Miguel Santos and Robert Chen," Collins read from the files. "Both former Marines, both discharged for disciplinary reasons." Sarah studied the photos. "So we've got 3 former military working together. They've got the training, the discipline, and they're targeting businesses they've surveilled in advance. The question is, where are they now, and where will they hit next?" They spent the rest of the afternoon canvassing the neighborhood, showing photos and asking questions. Most people were reluctant to talk to police, but Sarah's patient, non-threatening approach eventually paid off. An elderly man who ran a small auto repair shop remembered seeing the 3 men together recently. "They were looking at the check-cashing place across the street," he said. "Standing on the corner taking pictures with their phones, timing how long people spent inside." "When was this?" 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. I remember because it seemed strange. Why would 3 guys be so interested in a check-cashing place unless they were planning something?" Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. "Did you see what they were driving?" "Dark blue van, no windows in the back, one of those commercial vehicles like a contractor would use." Collins radioed in a request for any reports of a dark blue commercial van in the area of recent burglaries. The response came back within minutes. A van matching that description had been seen near each of the 3 robbery locations in the days leading up to the crimes. "They're still working the area," Sarah said. "The question is, what's their next target?" As evening approached, Collins suggested they patrol the business district where the other robberies had occurred. "If they're sticking to their pattern, they'll hit between 9 and midnight tonight." Sarah agreed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. Something about this case felt personal in a way she couldn't quite define. Maybe it was the constant harassment about her weapon choice, or maybe it was the professional nature of the criminals they were pursuing. But she sensed that her resolve was about to be tested in ways she had never experienced. They set up surveillance near a cluster of cash-heavy businesses, including a small bank branch, another pawn shop, and a money transfer service. Collins positioned their unmarked car where they could observe all 3 locations while remaining hidden. "Radio's on Channel 7, Collins said, settling in for what could be a long wait. "If we see anything, we call for backup before we move." Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Radio, handcuffs, pepper spray, and her taser. She thought about Morrison's words, about the constant questioning of her choices, and about her brother Miguel. Tonight, she might finally have the chance to prove that her way of policing could be just as effective as the traditional approach. What she didn't know was that Marcus Davis and his crew had been watching the police patrol patterns for weeks. And they had a plan that would put her beliefs, her training, and her controversial weapon choice to the ultimate test. The clock on their dashboard read 9:47 p.m. when Collins spotted movement near the money transfer service. "Sarah, look alive! Dark van pulling into the alley behind the Target building." Sarah raised her binoculars and felt her pulse quicken. 3 figures emerged from the van, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. One carried what appeared to be a crowbar, another had a duffel bag, and the third was scanning the area with the systematic attention of a trained lookout. "That's them," she whispered into her radio. "Requesting backup, 3 suspects, armed robbery in progress." The dispatcher confirmed backup was en route, but the closest unit was at least 5 minutes away. Collins started the engine, but before they could move, something went wrong with the suspect's plan. A police patrol car, unrelated to their investigation, happened to drive past the alley entrance at exactly the wrong moment. The lookout spotted the patrol car and immediately signaled his partners. Instead of retreating, the three men made a decision that would change everything. They ran toward Sarah and Collins's position, looking for an escape route through the maze of warehouses and abandoned buildings. Within seconds, what had been a surveillance operation became an active pursuit through the most dangerous part of the city. Collins grabbed his radio as their car lurched forward. "All units! Suspects fleeing on foot through the warehouse district, armed and extremely dangerous." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her taser, Morrison's mocking voice echoing in her head. Tonight, she would finally learn whether her choices could stand up to the test of real danger. The chase led through a maze of narrow alleys and abandoned loading docks. Collins drove with skill honed by years of patrol work, but the suspects knew the area well. They split up at a junction between two warehouse buildings, forcing Sarah and Collins to make a critical decision. "I'll take the one heading toward the river," Sarah said, already opening her door as Collins slowed the car. "You follow the other two." "Sarah, wait for backup!" But she was already out of the car, pursuing the suspect who had broken away from the group. This was Marcus Davis himself, though she didn't know it yet. He was carrying the duffel bag and running with the steady pace of someone accustomed to long-distance movement under pressure. Sarah keyed her radio as she ran. "Unit 47 in foot pursuit. Suspect heading east toward the waterfront. Collins is pursuing the other two suspects." Davis led her through a series of interconnected warehouse courtyards, each one darker and more isolated than the last. Sarah's training kicked in as she maintained visual contact while being careful not to run into an ambush. The suspect was military trained, which meant he would think tactically about his escape route. After 3 blocks, Davis ducked into an abandoned warehouse whose windows were boarded up with plywood. Sarah approached carefully, her taser in hand, calling for backup again. "Unit 47, suspect has entered the abandoned warehouse at Pier 18. Requesting immediate backup." The dispatcher's response crackled through static. "Unit 47, backup is still 4 minutes out. Do not enter the building alone." But as Sarah positioned herself outside the warehouse, she heard something that changed everything. A child's voice, crying and afraid. "Please don't hurt me, mister. I was just looking for somewhere to sleep." Sarah's blood ran cold. There was a homeless child inside the warehouse, and Davis had found them. She could wait for backup and hope nothing happened, or she could act now. Every instinct she had as a police officer told her to get that child to safety. She tried her radio again. "Unit 47, we have a hostage situation. Homeless child inside with the suspect. I'm going in." Collins's voice came through immediately. "Sarah, no. Wait for backup." But Sarah was already moving toward the warehouse entrance. Morrison's voice echoed in her head. "What happens when some drug-crazed maniac comes at you with a knife?" The difference was, this wasn't about proving Morrison wrong. This was about saving a child. The warehouse was dark inside, lit only by shafts of light coming through cracks in the boarded windows. Sarah moved carefully, using the concrete support pillars for cover as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. "Police!" she called out. "Let the child go, and we can work this out." Davis's voice echoed from somewhere in the maze of old equipment and storage containers. "Stay back! I've got a knife to the kid's throat!" Sarah's heart pounded, but her training took over. She had to assess the situation, find a tactical advantage, and protect the innocent victim above all else. She moved deeper into the warehouse, using the shadows to conceal her position. "What's your name?" she called out, trying to establish communication. "Doesn't matter what my name is. What matters is that you back off and let me walk out of here." Sarah caught a glimpse of movement near the back of the warehouse. Davis was positioned behind a stack of old crates, using them as cover while holding what appeared to be a young boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old. The child was terrified, frozen with fear. "I can't let you hurt the boy," Sarah said, moving to a position where she could see them more clearly. "But I want to help you too. You're ex-military, right? You served your country. This isn't who you are." "You don't know anything about who I am," Davis shouted back. "The military threw me away like garbage. Society treats veterans like we're broken. So I'll take what I need to survive." Sarah could see the knife now, a tactical blade held against the child's neck. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his face. This was exactly the kind of situation Morrison and the others claimed her taser couldn't handle. But Sarah had trained for this moment, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. Her choice of weapon wasn't born from fear or weakness. It was born from a deep understanding of when force was necessary and when it could make things worse. "Marcus," she said, taking a calculated risk by using his real name. "Your name is Marcus Davis. You were an Army Ranger. You served 3 tours overseas. You have skills and training that could help people, but right now you're holding a knife to a child." The use of his name clearly surprised him. His grip on the child shifted slightly, giving Sarah a better view of the situation. The boy was small and frightened, but he wasn't injured. Davis was using him as a human shield, but he hadn't hurt him yet. "How do you know my name?" "Because I'm a detective, Marcus. I investigated you and your crew. I know you've been robbing businesses to survive. I know the military discharged you. I know you feel like the system failed you." Sarah was slowly moving to a better position, but she had to be careful not to spook Davis into hurting the child. "I also know you were a good soldier once. Good soldiers protect innocent people. They don't hurt children." "Shut up!" Davis's voice cracked with emotion. "You don't know anything about being thrown away, about having your service mean nothing." This was Sarah's moment. She could see that Davis was emotionally vulnerable, conflicted about what he was doing. A traditional approach, threatening him with a gun, would likely escalate the situation and put the child at greater risk. But her taser gave her options. "You're right, Marcus. I don't know what that feels like, but I know what it feels like to lose someone you love to violence. I became a police officer because I wanted to be the kind of person who looks for solutions instead of just using force." Sarah was now in position, about 15 feet from Davis's location. She had a clear line of sight, but more importantly, she had identified his emotional state. He was desperate, angry, but not completely without conscience. The fact that he hadn't already hurt the child suggested he could still be reached. "I'm going to show you something, Marcus." Sarah slowly raised her taser so he could see it. "This isn't a gun. It's a taser. Do you know why I carry this instead of a pistol? Because you're too scared to carry a real weapon? Because my brother was killed by police during a mental health crisis. He was holding a knife just like you are now. The officers who responded didn't have any non-lethal options, and they made a split-second decision that ended his life forever." Davis was listening now. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. "I carry this taser because I believe there are alternatives to deadly force, even in situations like this one." "You're lying. You're just trying to get me to let my guard down." Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment when she had to trust her training, her instincts, and her choice of weapon. "Marcus, look at that boy. Really look at him. He's terrified, but he's also somebody's son, somebody's brother. If you hurt him, you'll never be able to take that back. I won't hurt him if you let me walk out of here. I can't do that, Marcus. You know I can't. But I can promise you this. I'm not going to shoot you. I'm not going to take your life away like someone took my brother's life. But I am going to stop you from hurting this child." In one fluid movement, Sarah stepped out from behind the pillar where she had been hiding. Davis spun toward her, pulling the child closer and raising the knife defensively. "Stay back!" But Sarah had anticipated this reaction. She had been studying Davis's position, his grip on the child, and the angle of the knife. As he turned toward her, he briefly exposed his torso while pulling the child to his left side to use as a shield. Sarah fired her taser. The electrodes struck Davis in the center of his chest. 50,000 volts of electricity disrupted his nervous system, causing his muscles to lock up involuntarily. His grip on both the knife and the child released immediately as he fell to the ground, incapacitated but alive. The boy scrambled away from Davis and ran towards Sarah, who caught him in her arms while keeping her taser trained on the suspect. Davis was down, conscious but unable to move due to the electrical current running through his body. "It's okay. You're safe now," Sarah told the boy while speaking into a radio. "Unit 47, suspect is down and secured. Child is safe. Need paramedics and backup at my location." Within minutes, the warehouse was flooded with backup officers, paramedics, and Collins, who had successfully apprehended the other two suspects with the help of arriving units. Collins approached Sarah as the paramedics checked on both the child and Davis. "How did you do it? We heard the taser discharge over the radio." "Right tool for the right situation," Sarah replied, watching as Davis was loaded onto a gurney. He was physically unharmed, but would face charges for armed robbery and kidnapping. The homeless boy, whose name was Tommy, was taken to social services after being cleared by the paramedics. Before he left, he hugged Sarah tightly. "Thank you for saving me," he whispered. Word of what had happened spread through the precinct within hours. Sarah had successfully resolved a hostage situation without anyone being seriously injured. Davis was alive and would face justice. The child was safe and unharmed, and she had done it all with the weapon that her colleagues constantly ridiculed. The next morning, Sarah walked into the precinct to find a very different atmosphere. Officers who had never spoken to her before nodded respectfully as she passed. Even Morrison and Bradley were notably quiet as she approached her locker. Sergeant Collins was waiting for her with a cup of coffee and a smile. "Heard about last night. Hell of a job, Detective." Captain Hayes called Sarah into her office an hour later. "I've read the reports from last night. I want you to know that your actions reflected the very best of what this department stands for. You showed restraint, tactical thinking, and genuine concern for the safety of everyone involved." "Thank you, Captain. I also want you to know that your choice of equipment has been vindicated. The taser was absolutely the right tool for that situation. A traditional firearm would have created an unacceptable risk to the child." As Sarah left the captain's office, she found Morrison waiting by her desk. For a moment, she braced herself for another confrontation. "Martinez," he said, his voice lacking its usual hostility. "I heard what you did last night." Sarah waited, unsure of what was coming next. "I was wrong," Morrison continued, clearly struggling with the words. "About your weapon choice, about your capabilities. What you did last night, resolving that situation without anyone getting killed, that took real skill." Sarah was stunned. In 3 years, Morrison had never admitted being wrong about anything. "I owe you an apology," he continued. "I let my old-school thinking get in the way of recognizing good police work. That taser of yours, it wasn't the weapon that made the difference. It was the officer carrying it." Word of Sarah's success spread beyond the precinct. The local newspaper ran a story about the detective who had resolved a hostage situation through innovative tactics and exceptional restraint. The police department's training division asked her to speak to new recruits about tactical alternatives and de-escalation techniques. More importantly, several other officers began asking Sarah about her choice to carry a taser. 2 female officers and 1 male officer ultimately made the same choice, creating a small but growing group of officers who saw non-lethal options as strengths rather than weaknesses. 6 months later, Sarah was promoted to senior detective and assigned to train new detectives in crisis negotiation and tactical alternatives. The warehouse district robbery crew had been successfully prosecuted, with Davis and his associates receiving prison sentences that reflected the serious nature of their crimes while acknowledging their cooperation in providing information about other criminal activities. Tommy, the homeless boy Sarah had rescued, was placed with a foster family and began attending school regularly. Sarah stayed in touch with him and his foster parents, providing a positive example of law enforcement that would influence his view of police for the rest of his life. On the anniversary of her brother Miguel's death, Sarah visited his grave and told him about the boy she had saved. "I became the kind of officer I wished had been there for you," she said quietly. "I think you would have been proud." The ridicule had stopped. The questioning of her choices had ended. Her badge had indeed proved them wrong, not through violence or intimidation, but through intelligence, courage, and the wisdom to choose the right tool for each situation. Detective Sarah Martinez had shown that sometimes the most powerful weapon an officer can carry is the knowledge of when not to use deadly force. Her taser had saved 3 lives that night: Marcus Davis, who lived to face justice and hopefully find redemption; Tommy, who learned that not all authority figures were threats; and her own, because she had proven to herself and her department that her way of policing was not only valid, but essential. In a profession often defined by split-second life-or-death decisions, Sarah had created a third option. She had shown that courage and tactical thinking could triumph over conventional wisdom, and that sometimes the most heroic choice was the one that preserved life rather than taking it. The weapon they had ridiculed became the tool that defined her career and changed her department's approach to crisis resolution. Her badge had proved them wrong, but more than that, it had proved that policing could evolve, grow, and become more than just a response to violence. It could become a solution to it.